I was here discussing the vaccines that we've developed for a variety of addictions, in particular cocaine, amphetamine, nicotine. You wouldn't think of that. Certainly the drugs of abuse themselves are quite small molecules, so by themselves they would not produce an immune response. But we attached those small molecules to carrier proteins, such as cholera toxin or a tetanus toxoid, and when we then inject that into people, they will produce antibodies not only to the cholera or the toxins that were in tetanus, but also produce antibodies to the drug of abuse that's attached to that protein. Well, it is certainly meant for people who are substance abusers. In particular, if they're cocaine abusers, a cocaine vaccine, methamphetamine abusers, a methamphetamine vaccine. And these are therapeutic vaccines, so that they're not designed for prevention in the usual sense of preventing abuse, and that's a fairly controversial topic about whether you'd want to do that. But certainly as therapeutic vaccines, that's what they're designed for. It's been in development for about 20 years now. The initial ones that I developed was one for cocaine and another one for nicotine. The cocaine vaccine we carried through late phase 3 studies for FDA approval. Those studies were completed a couple of years ago. Unfortunately, not a large enough percentage of the people developed very high level antibodies that are needed for this. Only about 50 or 60% developed those levels. We've since, in the last 20 years, developed much better vaccines that produce much higher antibody levels, and we're just beginning to go through the FDA approval process with those now. At the same time, the nicotine vaccines were picked up by the big pharma companies, by Pfizer, Novartis, GSK, and they went and developed the nicotine vaccine, so dropped out of that field. Those vaccines have been up through late phase 2, early phase 3 studies, ran into exactly the same problems as mine did, which was insufficient percentage of people got high enough antibody levels to make it effective. If you looked at about a third of the patients, they in fact did get fairly high antibody levels, and the vaccines did work in them. But the large pharma companies didn't feel like that was a sufficient percentage of patients to become the billion-dollar drug that they would envision for this. It's more than that. The dose of this carrier and its hapten that's linked to it is reasonably high, but what you need are better adjuvants. Adjuvants are things that in fact increase the amount of antibody and the affinity of those antibodies, and those adjuvants have developed fantastically over the last 20 years, and so we have a new adjuvant that's based on a derivative from a bacterial protein, and with that adjuvant we can produce 7 to 10 times the level of antibodies that we were able to produce before. They may want cocaine, but they won't get any effect from the cocaine. It will block it from getting into their brain. It will keep it circulating in their bloodstream, essentially. And then there's an enzyme in your bloodstream that breaks down cocaine, and that enzyme will steadily break it down, and you'll excrete the cocaine metabolite. So it's very effective at doing two things. First, simply keeping the cocaine out of your brain. The second is that it's a pharmacokinetic effect, so that it slows the entry of cocaine, whatever cocaine could get past the antibody, into the brain. And slow entry of cocaine into your brain is not reinforcing. It gives you some effects of cocaine, but it's not reinforcing. So if you take oral cocaine as an example, there's no real reinforcement that the Indians get in Peru when they take the cocaine, and they get the increase in cardiovascular effects, which is still there, but no high. The cocaine vaccine that we were working with required 5 vaccinations over a 3-month period, and from that we got fairly high antibody levels. Those antibody levels would stay up for 2 to 3 months. You'd then need a single booster vaccination to push the antibody levels back up again for several months. The newer vaccine that we're working on now looks like it would only take maybe 3 vaccinations over about 6 weeks. Lasts once again for about 3 months, and then you'd have to give boosters. We don't know if you repeatedly give boosters, will it in fact last longer and longer? There are certainly data from other types of immunology that suggests that would in fact occur, but you'd not be vaccinated for the rest of your life. You'd have to take the booster. So within several months of stopping boosters, you would no longer have you'd have tiny amounts of antibodies, but none that would be effective in any way.